Well, of course, it's no secret that Canada is facing some pretty serious economic challenges right now. We've got a federal government set to table a budget in addition to some big policy announcements with regard to major projects and industrial strategy. But some interesting new research out of the CD Howe Institute suggests that Canada needs a new economic and fiscal model. Joining us for more, very pleased to welcome to the program here Don Drummond, fellow in residence at the CD Howe Institute, former chief economist at TD Bank. He's also a fellow and adjunct professor at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University. Don, so great to have you with us here.
No, thank you very much.
So let's talk about the landscape first of all. We think back over the last couple of decades. I mean, Canada's faced some big challenges with the Great Recession, pandemic, and other examples. But what's unique about this moment, do you think?
Well, I think in addition to the cycles that you mentioned, and there's been some really bad ones, a big recession in the early 80s, another recession in the beginning of the 90s, the fiscal crisis mid-1990s, the financial crisis, the pandemic, they went on and on. But throughout that whole period, there was a gradual but dangerous slide. And I think that became less obvious. It wasn't clear that we had gone over a cliff, but we're kind of pretty close to the precipice for a long time. And if you look at a simple measure, like gross domestic product per capita relative to other countries, we used to be well above the average of all the developed countries. We're now down at the average. If you look at a key measure like our productivity, how much do we produce per hour worked? We had the third highest level of productivity within the 24 wealthy nations of the world, the OECD, when it started in the early 1960s, and we're in the middle of the group. And the OECD's projected the way we're going to be well below the average over the next couple of decades. So that's been playing out for quite some time. And that's been hurting, in technical terms, our gross domestic product. But obviously, it's been hurting the amount of income we have. And people complain they don't feel they're better off than they were, or better off than their parents were. They don't feel their wages are keeping up with inflation. All the above is true. And that in part relates to that underlying weakness. Now it's even more serious because we're facing this proposition. We have to change our economy to lessen the reliance about the United States. We have to take on countries around the rest of the world, but we have to do that from a non-competitive, non-productive position. So all this old baggage we've carried around for a long time suddenly feels a lot heavier than it was even before.
In terms of where we're at, I mean, we talk about this as a looming crisis, but we see the jobless numbers, the GDP numbers, kind of feels like we're in the midst of it right now.
Well, I don't pay a lot of attention to the really short term because that's going to be pretty bad. But
Sure.
I look out, where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years? And that might not be a good position. I mean, just take the tariff threat itself, the proposition, okay, we're going to have to build up a stronger domestic economy, but that means that we have to be more competitive than the countries we import from. And we're not at the moment. The Prime Minister's second strand is create excellence. Well, that requires strong universities and colleges. Almost all of our universities, in particular, are teetering on bankruptcy. They've had flat government funds. They've had, in the case of Ontario, tuition freeze. Now they've got the loss of revenue from foreign students, so they're in deep trouble. And it's retool businesses. Well, the average worker in Canada is 41 cents of machinery equipment to work with as the average worker in the United States. How are we going to be competitive with the U.S. to enter the European market, the Southeast Asian market, and then diversify to export to other countries? Well, unfortunately, no other country is saying we'd love to really do trade business with Canada. It's a cold, hard business. We'll buy
Yeah.
your product if it's a high quality and it's a low price. But again, that requires productivity. And it's not, does Europe stand there desperately needing our cars? Not really. They produce fine cars themselves. So it's not an easy market. And of the 10 models of cars that we make in Canada, they're pretty big. We make a lot of trucks. And the Europeans don't seem to be too taken with the idea of driving big trucks in congested urban areas. So, and then, okay, China's a huge market. They shut us out of canola effectively because they don't like something you do. They find some infestation that doesn't exist in some other crop, and you're shut out of that. India can be kind of hostile. And then you look at all the other countries, Vietnam, and look at, even adjusted for exchange rates, how low their wage rates are, and their productivity is closing along with us. So it's just a hard nut to crack, and it's It's the same thing about the tree. The best time to have planted the tree was 20 years ago. We should have fixed these all other problems, got rid of
Yeah.
domestic trade barriers, got rid of the weak productivity problem 20 years ago. We didn't. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it now, but now you've got to do it at the same time as you have to change our trade relationships. And it's tough. And, the point of doing the article and the research was just to point out, not to be too much of a doomsdayer, but it's not just the tariff threat that's at play. It's all these underlying weaknesses, and the tariff threat makes it more difficult to deal with the underlying weaknesses, and the underlying weaknesses make it more difficult to deal with the treasure. That's your classic vicious circle.
Yeah, well, no, yeah, no kidding. So there is a lot riding on this forthcoming budget from the government. We've seen some policy announcements in terms of industrial strategy, major projects, that sort of thing, in response to all of this. But have you seen or heard anything yet that would indicate we're prepared to try to challenge these issues around productivity and competitiveness?
No, not at all. And in fact, if the government were to do what it needs to do and do really radical things in a budget, I think it would go extremely badly because they've done no conditioning to the public. People don't like
Mhm.
changes to the status quo. They don't like surprises. If you were going to do something, you'd have to start earlier. And I put, let's rewind to the 1980s, the shock of the free trade agreement in 1989. Well, that was preceded by a royal commission, 1983 to 1985, a Department of Finance discussion paper in 1984, and the November 1988 election was pretty much around the singular issue of trade. This doesn't come as a surprise to Canadians, whether they liked it or not, and a lot didn't like it. It wasn't pulled out of a bag and surprised to them. So now we're going to have, basically, if we're going to have big policy changes, it's going to be by decree of the government. That's what a budget would be.
Yeah.
Or I think what is more likely is we'll continue to see some minor tweaks here and there. And they won't rock the boat, but it won't really get at the underlying problems.
So what do we need? And I guess, looking to the budget specifically, what would give you some indication that the government is serious about tackling these issues? What would you be looking for?
Well, first of all, it wouldn't just be the lip service to removing domestic trade barriers. And the federal government, and they're all doing high fives. They've done something. We've got an agreement on wine between Alberta and British
Yeah.
Columbia. We've got an agreement on some products in Atlantic Canada. The federal government has removed a few of the barriers. We still don't have free trade in labor. We've got different provinces having different certification programs. Transportation has still got barriers across provincial barriers. It just goes on and on. So we would finally, we've tried to strive to have free trade agreements around the world, and we're not even close to have one ourselves. We would change our method of taxation. Except for the United States, we rely far more on corporate and personal income taxes and less on goods and services taxes than other countries, and yet the income taxes are more harmful. We would have to reestablish a competitive advantage on corporate income taxes. We'd have to do something really jarring to encourage his business to invest. And you look how weak the business investment is, but would you, either as a domestic business or a foreign business, want to invest in Canada right now? Because
Right.
more likely than not, your success of your investment would be dependent upon access to the US market. And you'd have to think that that's in jeopardy. So it would take something really quite fundamental to change that. And of course, you just add on, we've already got a net debt to GDP ratio of over 40%, and we just saw another couple of billions the other day. So you'd have to change the tax system. We would have to get rid of this notion that we give far preferential treatment to small businesses over large businesses. Of course, you want small business. They have to start small business, but we have to do more to encourage them to grow. And this has to involve the provinces as well. We have to restore the strength of our post-secondary education. It has to, as the Prime Minister's office said, it has to create that excellence. But we rely double the extent of other developed countries on research from universities. And that's in part because our business sector does such like research. But the real level of funding for university-based research is the lowest it's been in 25 years.
Yeah.
Now, it's not all negative. There's opportunities, and I'll just pick up that last one. There's a lot of scientists, academics you like it, high skilled people who aren't too pleased to be in the United States. How would you feel to be in Harvard and Cornell and Stanford and taking all your funding away and told exactly what you can say and you can't say? We could pick up that. We the United States, ironically, had become a leader in clean growth around the world, and they're decided we don't like that. We don't want anything to do with that. We want to go back to a fossil-based era. Well, there's an opportunity to pick that up. So it's not all negative, but again, we have to do phenomenal things. There was an article in the major newspaper a couple of days expressing surprise we weren't picking up more of the high-level scientists and academics from the United States. The person who wrote that has no idea how the model works. Somebody who's a high level scientist in the United States doesn't operate as an individual. They got a team of 5 to 10 research assistants, all paid for them, and they got big contracts, often from the federal government. It's a package deal you have to offer. So again, we have to think differently. And we don't have the luxury of 6 years of planning for this the way we did with free trade agreement and NAFTA. But I think we have to involve the public much more. The public has to be aware of what the challenges are. They have to be aware of what the possible solutions are, and then they have to input to that all over a very compressed time period. And that can't happen if you're going to lead with a budget in October. The government absolutely has to lay out the economic and fiscal accounts. If I were in the government, I would be strongly recommending to lead as soon as you come back with an economic and fiscal statement, have a period of consultations with Canadians. And you just look at, Trudeau promised a couple of years ago in a budget to have a productivity commission. It was in the budget. We never heard one word about it since. In the
Yeah.
Liberal election platform earlier this year, they promised a task force to look at how we tax corporations. Have you heard anything about that? Not a word.
No.
So there's some things that we could have put ourselves in a better position to be prepared for this, and we didn't do it. So, but that's all doesn't mean you don't do it now. You have to do it, but time is not our friend.
No, I mean, we did see the government back away from the changes to how capital gains are taxed, but that just kind of reverts us back to the status quo that we had in the first place, doesn't it?
Well, the capital gains was very upsetting. I disagreed with the policy measure itself. The biggest thing with capital gains, if you bought something 20 years ago and selling it today, almost all the capital gains you're paying is the inflation on it. It's not a real gain. You should be taxing real gain. So ideally, you should be indexing it. The 50% inclusion was a rough proxy of that. You're not allowed to deduct fully your losses either, so you don't want 100% inclusion. But the way it was designed, it was like a silly populist measure to say we, like you, hate rich people, and with no good reason we're going to hurt them and make them suffer. So why did they give 2 months to deal with it before it took effect? Well, they just wanted to hurt people. And if you owned a publicly traded share, you were okay. But what if you owned a property? What if you own private shares? You can't divest them in 2 months. And the only reason they gave that tight deadline is because they wanted to get a revenue windfall because they promised the deficit was going to be below 40, and clearly it wasn't. So it was
Yeah.
just handled so badly. They could have, for example, just allowed you a deemed position. You own a stock in it. You bought it at 100. It's now 200. They could have said, you don't have to sell this, but you have to pay the capital gains from the 100 to 200, but keep your stock. Why are we telling people what they need to sell? That's one of the exemption of home heating from the GST, and then that were for me the tangible policy signs that government had lost it, and they become really desperate, and they're just doing bad policy in the interest of being populist, and they got what they deserved. It didn't win them any favors. That's the interesting thing about bad policy that tries to get curry favor. It doesn't usually work.
You mentioned the role the provinces have in all of this, and they've certainly got their own ideas for what they want Ottawa to do, but they're not uninterested just observers here. I mean, as you say, they've got a lot of role to play in interprovincial trade barriers when it comes to funding post-secondary institutions, and even on the taxation side, right? Provinces set their own corporate tax rates too. So is there more of a role for the provinces to play here as well?
Absolutely. We have long had this terminology, the senior level of government, the junior level of government. Is it like, give me a break? Most of the actions at the provincial level. I mean, ask the citizen what really matters for you. It's hard to imagine health and education doesn't first come to your mind. Provincial. The federal government may give a block transfer, but all they do in those fields is write a check. You know, I always get a bit of a kick because when Trudeau was asked why did the civil service increase by 1/3, he said, well, we introduced these new programs like dental care. And excuse me, the federal government doesn't operate the dental care. That's offered
Right.
by the provinces and the insurance companies. There can't be very many people associated with that problem. But, federal government does defense. It does the major transfers, which is basically writing checks. We're talking about the need to build more homes. But again, most of the policy levers for that are at the provincial level. The rules about density, et cetera, on the provincial level, not the federal level. So we need to involve the provinces a lot more, and it can't be this kind of subservient relationship that they've had before. But on the other hand, if you look at the agenda for the Council of the Federation, which is the gathering of the provinces and territories without the federal government, almost all of it is just a complaining session about the federal government. I mean, if you want to be mature and take the lead in policy, take it. That's my view.
Yeah.
Don't act like you're under the thumb of the federal government.
You mentioned the deficits the federal government has been running as of late. They've been considerable, and part of that was linked to the pandemic, obviously. But I think we're still in a situation where we can't just ignore the impact of deficits and debt, as much as we're going to see, I think, some substantial deficits as the government tries to address this whole situation. Is that a concern? Is that something the government needs to be careful with?
The reason people like me preach that you want to be in fiscal situation is so you have the flexibility to deal with the crises. And there always will be a crisis. I can't tell you beyond this tariff what the next one will be, but you just have to look back in history. If there's always been one in history, why would your assumption be there's not going to be one in the future?
Right.
When we got hit with the financial crisis, we weren't in bad financial shape, and it allowed the government to temporarily massively increase spending. And we weren't in that bad financial shape when the pandemic came, and that gave us a flexibility to deal with it. We don't have that flexibility now.
Right.
We should have a debt GDP ratio somewhere in the 20%, but we're over 40%. And on top of that, we got the enormous pressure of taking defense spending to 5% of GDP with no source of funding identified. Not to mention the aging of the population, what that's going to do to pension payments, or for the provinces, what it's going to do to healthcare payments. So it just chokes off your various different options to deal with things, to change policy, and it certainly ties your hand when you have to deal with a crisis, and there will always be a crisis.
So even if we see a situation where, the courts strike down the bulk of Trump's tariffs, or we're able to salvage CUSMA through renegotiations, does that necessarily mean that it's crisis averted?
Well, first of all, I try to suppress any inclination I would have expressing pleasure that the courts are giving a hard time, because all they're basically saying is the president didn't have the right to do it. It has to come through Congress. Well, Congress has demonstrated they will do everything and anything the president wants. So that's maybe a delay, but that would get rubber stamped. If I would be delighted if we came out with a reasonable basis and a renegotiation of CUSMA. I think life would be way better if we did. But again, you seeing what's happening in the world, you really can't attach a high probability to that. It's pretty clear they view a de minimis tariff barrier of 10 to 15% with higher barriers and selective views. I don't know why they would carve out for Canada. I wish they would. Obviously, we should try for that, but that sounds a little bit never land to think that that's going to land.
Yeah, I think so. Well, we'll see what awaits us in the weeks ahead. Much more is mentioned, cdhowe.org. Don Drummond, appreciate the insight. Thank you so much for joining us here.
You're welcome.
Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.